Good morning, and welcome to the California Historical Radio Society. Today, we have the privilege of welcoming our distinguished speaker, Jennifer Waits, who will be delving into the fascinating world of early college radio, a pivotal chapter in the history of broadcasting. Jennifer Waits, a renowned expert in the realm of radio history, has dedicated a significant portion of her career to exploring the intricacies of college radio and its profound impact on culture and communication. Her insights and research have shed light on how college radio stations have not only been incubators for musical and journalistic talent, but have also played a crucial role in shaping the media landscape. Today, Jennifer will take us on a journey back in time to the roots of college radio, tracing its evolution and highlighting its influence on both the broadcasting industry and college campuses across the nation. She will share captivating stories of innovation and how these stations became platforms for experimentation and creativity. As we explore the early days of college radio, we'll gain a deeper understanding of its significance in the broader context of American cultural history. Jennifer's expertise will illuminate the challenges and triumphs faced by these stations, offering us a unique perspective on the enduring legacy of college radio. So without further ado, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm super excited to be here today. I grew up in a family that was very interested in history, and I've been obsessed with radio for a long time, so it's wonderful to be speaking at the California Historical Radio Society. And although much of the story that I'm going to talk about today is focused on the East Coast, I wanted to at least start out, since I'm a Bay Area native, and give you a little bit of my radio backstory. And here's a bit of a rundown of what we're going to talk about today. So I'll give you a bit of my backstory, talk about why I think college radio is important. We'll look at some early student radio clubs and college radio stations, wireless activity, look at college radio in the 1920s, and then talk briefly about carrier current radio in the 1940s, which was another important period in college radio. And then I'll talk about current efforts to preserve the history of college radio. So thought we would do a little bit of me. So I grew up in the South Bay, and my parents were super into going to flea markets. Pretty much every weekend we were going to an outdoor antique show or flea market. And my dad restored some old radios and phonographs. So here he is with me, like keeping my hand away from the radio dial. He does not want me to touch that radio. But I remember looking at some of the descriptions on the dial that had these faraway lands on them, and it just seemed so exciting and mysterious that a radio could take you all over the world. And then in kindergarten, my parents gave me a tape recorder, which was just amazing, and immediately at Christmas, I started going around the room recording all of my grandparents, interviewing them about, what they thought this object was, and most of them didn't think it was a tape recorder. They had very exciting descriptions of what it was. As a kid, I was listening to stations like KFRC. I remember listening to The Shadow and radio drama in my bedroom at night. Hearing DJs like Dr. Donald D. Rose, and bands like Captain Tennille and the Bee Gees. So that was my Bay Area radio childhood. And with this tape recorder, my sister and I eventually recorded mock radio shows, kind of influenced by Dr. Demento. So those were my early DJ days. And then when I was in 6th grade, I saw this jukebox costume in Dynamite magazine, and my dad helped me make this jukebox costume, and I recorded my mom's Bill Haley and the Comet records and had a cassette of them on my red tape recorder that I put a rope around the tape recorder so it was hanging around my neck. And when people put treats into the slot, I would play music, so I was like a human jukebox. And my dad's a great artist and very detail-oriented, so he insisted on writing "It's a Wurlitzer" on the back of the costume, yeah. And apparently my sister is bitter to this day that my dad helped so much on this costume because he didn't, devote as much time to her costumes, but that's okay. It's still hanging in my parents' garage, the jukebox. But it's funny, at the time I didn't know that DJing would be in my future, so it's fun to have this memory. And then in high school, I started listening to the Quake, KQAK, and hearing all this amazing new wave music and ska and goth, and it really opened my ears because up to that point I'd been listening to hard rock on KSJO and KOME. So suddenly this whole world of punk and new wave entered my ears, and I was super excited and got introduced to bands like Depeche Mode and The Cure, Susie and the Banshees, Book of Love, and so much more. And when the Quake left the airwaves in 1985, like many people, I was devastated. I made recordings of the last few days of the station. And then I turned left on the dial to find that music. And so that's when I discovered stations like KFJC, and there are a number of my KFJC colleagues in the room, which I'm excited about. So I started listening to KFJC at Foothill College, KZSU at Stanford University, KSCU at Santa Clara University, and KSJS at San Jose State. So those were the stations I could get. And I never turned back after, that kind of, the Quake was sort of my introductory point to college radio, and then once I discovered it, I never turned back. And there's a tape of KSJS, the San Jose State station that I recorded in 1985. They did a countdown at the end of the year, so the top songs of the year. So then I went off to college on the East Coast and was still listening to college radio and tuned into stations out there in Philadelphia. So at Drexel University and University of Pennsylvania, they both had great radio stations. And then that led me to entering the doors at the radio station at my college, at Haverford College, WHRC. So my second semester, I don't know why I waited a semester. My second semester, I walked into the student radio station. It was in a stuffy basement in the bowels, like next to the back end of the cafeteria, but it was exactly where I wanted to be. I was around fellow music lovers. There were creaky chairs, aging audio equipment, like racked, these amazing records from days gone by. It was AM carrier current, and the main audience, like your biggest audience would be during meal times because it was piped into the cafeteria. So it was the big time. So I didn't realize it at the time, but WHRC had been around since the early 1940s, and then it wasn't even the first radio station on campus. So in 1923, students at Haverford launched AM radio station WABQ, and it was students in the radio club. They caught the radio bug and worked together to build this remarkable broadcast station. It was a rare student-led radio station at the time, and at one point it could be heard 1,000 miles away in every direction. It had a fancy studio and largely home-built equipment. At one point it had 2 pianos, an upright and a grand piano. I mean, it's really pretty mind-boggling. Musical groups like Haverford's Mandolin Club, which seemed to be one of the most popular music groups on campus. The mandolin apparently was quite big in the 20s. Musical groups took to the air, and they also broadcast performances from the Ardmore Theater. And the Ardmore Theater had this new organ that was purported to be the largest theater organ in the world in 1925. So they worked very closely with the theater and were able to do these broadcasts. Talks and lectures were also a staple of WABQ, including broadcasts from a midwinter dinner in 1924 so alums from all over would tune in to these broadcasts, and an alum who tuned in from 100 miles away called in after, like immediately after the lecture, because he had comments about hazing, because that had been discussed at this, midwinter dinner for alums, and he had some words to say about that. And several of the members of the Haverford College Radio Club and WABQ went on to big careers in radio and broadcasting. William S. Halstead, who was one of the key players in the development, management, and promotion, he did a lot of promotion of WABQ. He was said to have started experimenting with spark coils at age 8 and was running amateur stations before he got to Haverford. And he went on to do many things following graduation, including developing a portable shortwave radio system that was used on an expedition by Byrd to Antarctica, and that was in 1928. He also worked in the movie industry and helped develop television systems around the world. There's more on that. This was an article in the Haverford Student newspaper about this exhibition, this Antarctica experience. And another of the early leaders of WABQ was Gerald Gross, who after graduation went to the Bureau of Standards and then the Federal Radio Commission, and participated in the formation of the engineering division of the Radio Commission in 1928. And he later became the chief of the international division of the FCC, among other roles there, and then went on to be the Secretary General of the International Telecommunications Union in Geneva, which was a specialized agency of the United Nations. And that was from 58 to 1966. So it's interesting that these students who, were at one of the earliest student-run broadcasting stations then went on and were doing things, related to radio inventions and also regulation at the FCC. Sadly, Haverford's radio legacy and history was lost on me until years later. When I returned to campus for a reunion many years ago, I stopped by WHRC and was saddened to see that the record library had been decimated. And I'd helped to bring in a lot of the records as a music director, so I was super bummed. And when I asked about it, there were all kinds of rumors like, they sold off the records to fund a Roots concert was one rumor. So it piqued my interest even more to find out what happened to the records, and then it led to finding out more about radio history there in general. So it led me down a path, and I'm still not done. It's, the research is endless. But it also gave me an appreciation for the little told stories of student efforts in college radio, and I became focused on sharing those stories to help give credit to some of the early innovators like Halstead and other nameless students. So today I want to take you back in time to the earliest days of college radio, an under-the-radar period that's been erased from college radio history so many times. And in his 1980 memoir, The Gas Pipe Networks, A History of College Radio, 1936 to 1946, maybe some of you have seen it, it's this small little tome. Lewis Block writes, I had the great privilege of participating in the development of college radio from its very beginning at Brown University in 1936. So I remember reading that line and being puzzled that college radio stations from a decade earlier were totally erased from this story. And, he is focusing on campus-only carrier current stations, but it still sadly leaves out these early pioneers from the 20s who broadcast over AM and amateur radio. So let's travel back over 100 years ago to learn about this secret early period. On March 25th, 1921, Malcolm P. Hansen from radio experimental station 9XM at University of Wisconsin wrote a letter to the Union College Radio Club in Schenectady, New York. So he writes, we have to date received your radio phone better than any other, and now hear you regularly on Thursday evenings. On March 10th, your signals were great. On a single state audio frequency amplifier, you were so loud we could still understand your speech and music with the audibility meter on its limit. You came in somewhat louder than KDKA, whom we heard just before. and your modulation and quality of music were even better than that of KDKA. So the letter goes on to ask about getting some technical advice, and it encloses the schedule for 9XM. And I think it's remarkable that these music broadcasts from an amateur station at Union College were being compared favorably to, this commercial broadcast station, KDKA. And at the time, in their second year of regular broadcasts, the Union College amateur station had accumulated stacks of fan mail and was also working to forge connections between other college radio bugs. A few years later, as I've mentioned, in 1923, students in the radio club at Haverford on Philadelphia's main line launched licensed broadcast station WABQ, and similar to their cohorts at Union College, they publicized their endeavors and received national press for both the radio station and their ongoing amateur radio experiments. And at Haverford, they did what was said to be the first interoceanic chess match by radio with Oxford. So radio clubs like those at Haverford and Union are important predecessors to what we understand to be college radio today. Of course, amateur radio stations still exist, and for many years existed in parallel with broadcast stations on college campuses. But I think this period in the 1910s, 1920s is a fascinating time to explore, because that amateur work really blurred into the work of the broadcast stations, at student-led stations. So I just want to set the stage a little bit and talk about how I define college radio. And I'm thinking about extracurricular student-led stations. So in the 1920s, there were also stations at universities that were really run by professors that had entirely different aims. But I'm thinking about students and thinking about student-managed efforts. And I'm also trying to stay away from first claims, because that gets really dangerous, and people are always asking what was the first college radio station, and there's so many ways you can define it. And I think it's freed me up a little bit to start including amateur radio, because there was so much blurring at the time. So rather than getting hung up on definitions of whether somebody was licensed or amateur or what kind of license they held, we'll keep it loose. And also, as much as I'd love to, I don't have a list of all the stations. This research is often going to one archive at a time, so I'm constantly learning about new radio stations and activities, and if you know of more activities, let me know. But this is not exhaustive. I'm just giving you a glimpse of a handful of places. There's still a lot of research to be done. And okay, so beginning in the late 1800s, there was a lot of radio work happening on campuses, largely in physics departments and professors. But students often played a key role in those projects, even building radio stations. And then the first radio clubs appeared soon after, or early 1900s. So huge shout out to Bob Ridzeski, who alerted me to this very early radio club at Harvard. And I mean, this hasn't made it into any of the mainstream reporting about radio club history, because another radio club is said to be the first radio club of any kind, and it was not this one. So this is breaking news, so huge thanks to Bob. So Bob of the California Historical Radio Society, where I am today, he shared this research with me related to radio pioneer Robert Gowan, who Bob told me that Gowan started what may have been the first college radio club in the country at Harvard's Weld Hall around 1906. And a 1909 issue of the Harvard Illustrated magazine discussed these dorm-based wireless activities. And they wrote, "Finally, it became more convenient to call a fellow up by wireless and ask if he intended going to town than to walk across the yard on a personal visit." So it's amazing, amazing. And it really makes you think forward to, how important this was for so many future communications activities. So after students did rogue experiments with wireless telegraphy from their dorm rooms, the Weld Phone Telegraph Company of Harvard University was formed. The name, which is so glamorous, means to write with winged sounds. I feel like you have to say winged rather than winged. It was conceived by a student in the dorm, which was Weld Hall, and the student was doing graduate studies in Greek, so that's why the name is so Greek. A 1923 radio news article written by Gowan recounted that the club offered wireless messages to all parts of the yard and vicinity, and that gradually stations sprang up in the different dormitories, which we see this later with carrier current broadcasting too, where you might have one station initially and then a bunch crop up in many dorms. Bob noted that their enthusiasm may have resulted in Harvard instituting its first radio class, which again, I think is an interesting example of student innovation then leading to curriculum changes, which is another theme that we'll see later. So a few years later, and this, I don't know if you can see everything on the slide, but this has their little form you could fill out to have a phone tarogram message sent to somebody. It's just really amazing. So a few years later in 1908, the Wireless Telegraph Club of Columbia was launched by students, and this is the club that people think was the first amateur radio club of any kind, not just on a college campus. But as we know from Bob, it was not. An article in The Sun described 300-foot-long wires strung 100 feet above the ground, adding that school officials were skeptical at first about letting them erect the wires for fear of disfiguring the classic beauty of the university. Despite that, professors in the electrical engineering department admitted that there was a need for wireless telegraphy coursework to be added to the curriculum. So similar to what happened at Harvard, these student innovations then led to professors realizing, oh, we should be teaching this too. So far in my research at Haverford, I haven't found a radio club as early as these two, but there were classes in wireless telegraphy, and students did set up stations in their dorm rooms. There was a 1914 entry in the yearbook for the student Malcolm Ferris, and it shows him at the wireless there. And it says, Ferris has drawn some attention and fame to himself by means of instituting a wireless station. For those who drop in on him, an evening's entertainment is assured. For Malk is a wireless fiend. Daily, amidst a maze of wires, switches, keys, and coils, he will conjure up for you all sorts of messages from the ambient air. A gentle soul, my worthies, and his like shall inherit the earth. It's kind of amazing reading these old yearbooks, and there are often these just amazing descriptions of, the people writing the yearbook would write these amazing descriptions of their classmates that were so poetic. So there's more. In 1915, another Haverford student, Percival Roy Allen, he wrote his thesis on resonance in wireless circuits, and then there's actually a cartoon in the yearbook that's showing him at his wireless, and I'm not sure if this is in his room or if it's in an official wireless room, but the sign on the wall says, "Silence in the wireless room. Message from Bryn Mawr now being received." So Haverford College is was a men's college at the time, and Bryn Mawr still is a women's college. They're very close together, and definitely sister schools. So I thought that was cool that there was an indication that there was wireless activity between the two at the time. And just to give you a little perspective, there were 179 students on campus around this time. And I think I want to read part of this to you because it's just so amazing. I won't read the whole thing. So this is Percival Roy Allen. Dee 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 da da, da dee dee dee, da dee dee. It's Parson at the wireless again. He must be trying to relieve his feelings after a chicken rag. So I guess that's jazz, right? A rag? After a chicken rag at Overbrook, or with one of Mother Carey's brood. So there's also always inside jokes. He always needs relief after the awful time he has trying to keep conversation flowing as he rocks from side to side in mental anguish. The spark has stopped now, and he is gazing out the window with a faraway look. Fair Harold's angular finger is now pointing out a circular object in the wondrous array of electrical contraptions on the table and windowsill. What's that for? PR's hands now come into action, and while they are making uncertain hyperbolas, his voice makes an accompaniment. That's the thing to sort of make this thing go. So I guess he's talking to himself. Apparently understanding himself, he ambles to the Victrola and starts Cohen on the telephone. Pretty soon he becomes dissatisfied with the way it is running, and while the machine is being operated upon, a monologue ensues. And so he's talking to himself. I mean, I got excited thinking there was something going on with the Victrola and the wireless, but I think it was more background noise. But this is what happens in research. You're like, oh my God, what's happening with the Victrola? But I think probably not that much. So this is 1915, and then around this time there were some radio clubs forming at other colleges, including at Union. This is when their radio club started up. And then, as probably many of you know, the next few years there was a big disruption with war. So students were leaving for the war effort, amateur radio ceased, and campus really cleared out at a lot of these schools. So there were hardly any students. But then when people came back, some also had gained radio experience in the military. So late 1918, students returning to campus. And then amateur activities start up again. And then you start to see more of these radio clubs starting. So in Schenectady, New York, the radio club at Union College started garnering headlines for its exploits. Significantly, on October 14th, 1920, students broadcast a short concert of music over the radio, over amateur radio. The school newspaper previewed the event, writing, "If for the next week you hear noise of thunder every time you try to phone, you know the electric jazz experts are tuning up. And they are some jazz experts with high-power spark discharges. Starting next Thursday night, the radio club will give a concert via radio. This will be a weekly habit. If at some future time you have a dance on hand and your jazz artists fail you, like your Victrola is on the fritz, call up 2ADD, tell them your trouble, and if you've got a hairpin, a wire, a coil or two, and a phone, you will have all the music you may wish via radio." So this was written in the paper October 12th, 1920. So acknowledging that you had to be kind of a radio expert to be able to hear the radio at that point in time. So following that first successful radio concert at Union College, headlines in the student newspaper proclaimed, "Aerial concert is first in collegiate history." So, I mean, their first claims, this might be true, I don't know. And ethereal recitals will be given weekly in the future. And the article said, transmitting the music from a phonograph into the receiver of a wireless telephone and then to amateur radio operators within a radius of 50 miles, members of the Union College Radio Club gave what is believed to be the first wireless musical concert of an American college organization, playing vocal and instrumental records. So, to me, this is college radio. Even though it was amateur radio, you know, they were told people about it in advance, they played music, they had an audience. Another thing that I think is really notable about this early broadcast is that the amateur station call letters used to ADD were those of a radio prodigy named Wendell W. King, and he started his own amateur station when he was 12 and was the first black student to attend Union College for a significant length of time. He'd been involved with amateur radio since 1911 and may have been the most technically proficient student connected with early Union radio, according to an article in the Encyclopedia of Union College History. And he'd already been president of the Troy Amateur Radio Club and had served in the Army Signal Corps and had worked for the radio section of General Electric. So pretty remarkable. And his photo was in the first slide when all of you walked in today, in the slide of the Union College Radio Club. So they continued to do regular Thursday night music broadcasts over amateur radio and also over an experimental station, 2XQ. It got the license for that in 1919. And they received listeners who wrote in to report that they had heard and were enjoying the transmissions. In addition to the weekly broadcast, the club did various stunts. They outfitted a baby carriage with a radio set. They also broadcast radio church services, including hymns that were played over a phonograph and songs by a college quartet. Another accomplishment in May 1921 was the wireless transmission of the junior prom music. And according to an article, it was the signal for hundreds of dances in this section of the country. And before the prom, the student newspaper reported that it would be the music of Ford Dabney's syncopated orchestra of Ziegfeld Midnight Frolic fame. These names are insane. That will be heard as far west as Nebraska and by ships far out at sea. So it's amazing to think about this prom where they're playing music, all over the land. And the event was overnight, which also was interesting to me, but I guess it makes sense with radio at the time too. So the prom went from 10:30 p.m. until 6 a.m. So we never had cool dances like that. And beyond these early amateur and experimental broadcasts, Union College was also one of the first colleges to obtain a limited commercial license to operate a broadcast station. The license for WRL was issued in March 1922 and was held by Union College until 1924. Only a few other stations operating at colleges or universities obtained this type of broadcast license earlier, and those were University of Minnesota and University of Wisconsin, both in January 1922. So something that's been interesting for me to kind of find in my research is how radio clubs interacted with each other. So a notable thing about the Union College Club was that they were regularly talking to other clubs. There's an amazing scrapbook from the 1920s at Union College, full of correspondence. There was a letter from the CCNY Radio Club at the College of the City of New York from December 1920. And their letter said, "Fellow radio bugs, we were more than pleased to receive your communication. Your suggestion interests us very much, and we would be glad to cooperate with you in furthering an intercollegiate radio organization of some sort." So they were definitely reaching out, trying to make something happen as far as communicating more formally. Interest was brewing, and in January 1921, a Union College alumnus wrote that the Union College Club is trying to foster an intercollegiate system of communication by wireless. A large number of schools here in the East have signified a desire to participate in such a schedule, and the college here is already installing a more powerful set. And then this gossip page is talking about City College of New York. So within a few years, the City College of New York Radio Club did in fact launch the Intercollegiate Radio League in 1924. An article in the Bucknell Alumni Monthly said that the league's aim was to facilitate communication between colleges of news items and to make it possible for college chess and checker teams to play through the air. So one of the charter members was Haverford College Radio Club, which makes sense. And the Haverford Yearbook in 1924 talked about, during that school year, they'd done a wireless chess match with the City College Radio Club using code. And that was apparently the first intercollegiate radio chess game, and then followed up by the match I told you about where Haverford did a chess match with Oxford in December 1924. And nobody won that match. They actually, because of weather, they had to stop, and so there was no winner. Somebody asked me at one point who the winner was, and it was challenging. And Haverford's Quaker, and competition is you shouldn't be competitive anyway, so who cares if nobody won? I was also interested that in 1924, the Haverford Radio Club and the student newspaper at school, the Haverford News, collaborated to report on a meeting of the Intercollegiate Radio League. So an article in the News wrote that in this number of the News, so in this edition, is the first article received by radio to be printed in a college paper. And I think this article may have even been written by Halstead, who was very good at promoting their activities. So at a small college, often the people, you notice oh, he's on the staff of the newspaper. He's head of the radio station. So anyway, so meeting notes from this meeting of the Intercollegiate Radio League were transmitted by amateur radio between two members of the radio club. And then the story was relayed to the college by telephone. And then this whole scenario was a pilot test for an intercollegiate radiogram service, according to the Haverford News. So they imagined that they would use, telephone and amateur radio to get news stories more quickly to the newspaper. So this broader desire for colleges to organize was longstanding. In 1915, a physics professor at Massachusetts Agricultural College was hoping to build a wireless station and even predicted the future radio groups that came to be. And an article from 1915 said that he suggested that an intercollegiate radio league be organized. It's funny that it's the exact same name as something that was organized. And so this dream in 1950 was that stations at least in all the Eastern colleges, would organize for the transmission of intercollegiate news. Elections, new movements, results of athletic contests, and such items will become a matter of common knowledge among the members of the league, revolutionizing relations between colleges as regards current events. So, that's kind of what you saw with this little pilot test at Haverford, where you could use amateur radio to get news quickly to the student newspaper. So the story has to become sad. By the late 20s, broadcast stations at colleges and universities, it's not sad yet. So they were organizing. So we were talking about amateur just now, but the broadcast stations organized for a little bit too. And there was the College and University Association of Broadcasting Stations that drew together this really interesting mix of stations, including WABQ at Haverford, and then stations that were more overtly focused on educational radio. And so this is around 1926, there were pieces written about them, and the educational aspect of that organization is what really ramped up, and it eventually became the National Association of Educational Broadcasters. So there was this early organizing, but by the end of the 1920s, the student-led stations and a lot of college stations left the airwaves. Things became more difficult for a number of reasons that I won't get into. But the impact of these pioneering stations remained, and then student radio has been reimagined over and over again in the years to come. And the next time it happens is about a decade later. So by the late 30s, students at Brown start setting up these campus-only AM carrier current stations. And in 1941, there was this amazing article in the Saturday Evening Post by Eric Barnow and about these radiator pipe broadcasters. And it's very whimsical. The article kind of talks about the dean of the campus hearing these strange things on the radio and, what's happening? They track them down and they're not licensed, and is this okay? But he also goes a bit into the details of what they are, and that the radiator pipes of a university can be turned into a transmitting antenna, and that the college electric wires or the water pipes or the gas pipes or the metal frameworks of buildings can be used for the same purpose. Transmitters in building basements could be connected to the pipes or the metal, and anyone with a radio within a short distance of the transmitter or of the metal network being used as the antenna can pick up the station, according to Barnow, this article. So these carrier current stations proliferated all over the country, and it's really this is really kind of the beginning of the blossoming of student college radio. And the Intercollegiate Broadcasting System, or IBS, they formed around 1940, 1941 to help organize these stations and also help students set up new radio stations. And they also collaborated on bringing in advertising, since they were unlicensed, they weren't regulated by the FCC in that way. So carrier current stations could go out and get advertising, and they did. And so carrier current stations were at women's colleges too, and there were women's college radio clubs that were early members of Intercollegiate Broadcasting System. And so some of the stations that got started in the 1940s were at Wellesley, beginning in 1942, Radcliffe College around 43, 44, Smith College, 1949, Bryn Mawr College, like very early in the 40s. And it's funny, in interviewing alums, there were people who said there was no college radio station there. Like, I have evidence, it existed for at least 20 years. And Sarah Lawrence College in 1946. And an article in the Harvard Crimson in 1944 talks about the Radcliffe station, saying that one of its shows was called Just Between Us Girls. And it says, Harvard men can't hear this. It's just a lot of gossip about men and dates anyway. And then another program, Americans in Music, is a history of music in the Americas with recorded examples of folk music from all over the Western Hemisphere. And that show was actually also played on the Harvard station on Tuesday nights at 10 o'clock. And speaking of Harvard, the Harvard boys were apparently not as welcoming to all the women's college stations. Over at Sarah Lawrence, there was energy around starting a campus radio station in 1945, and there was a proposal made for Radio Sarah Lawrence, and two women students presented the idea to seek student support, but apparently they encountered these naysayers along the way, and the campus, which was the name of the newspaper, reported in 1947 that Radio Sarah Lawrence was originally built because Harvard laughed at Sarah Lawrence and said Sarah Lawrence couldn't build or run a radio station. The students would be far too busy polishing their nails and meeting under the clock, which is again another, like, it must have significance if you're at Sarah Lawrence, like meeting under the clock must have been a thing. But, you know, the women at Sarah Lawrence showed those dudes, and WSLC was an active radio station, and they aired poetry, music, comedy, and even a rebroadcast of a campus talk by Eleanor Roosevelt in 1951. So not too shabby. So kudos, you know, for building that station anyway, despite, or, you know, maybe because of the taunting. I talked about Intercollegiate Broadcasting System as an early organization that was formed, you know, to help these carrier current stations and serve them. And there were also some additional groups formed. There were some regional ones. There was a Mid-Atlantic group that brought together stations from Haverford, Bryn Mawr, I think Penn and Swarthmore. There was the Ivy Network, and then another early organization called NACB that I'm still learning a little bit about that was just for carrier current stations. And while only broadcasting to the campus on carrier current might seem limited, these stations often had really huge participation. Like at Haverford sometime, you know, at a very small college, it seemed that a quarter of the student body was participating in the radio station. You know, and also you had a built-in audience, so they had impact, capturing a lot of student listeners. And I also think the combined impact of all of these carrier current stations as a whole is important and powerful. So during the 50s and beyond, some stations moved beyond campus with licensed AM, licensed FM, FCC licenses. Others added cable, broadcast over public address systems, some broadcast over phone, you could call a phone and listen to the station, and eventually moved to the internet. And in fact, the first radio stations of any kind to simulcast their radio broadcast over the internet were college radio stations. UNC Chapel Hill, Georgia Tech, and University of Kansas. So I'd just like to throw out these important contributions of college radio. So, I think college radio history is important, to share some of these innovations that were made by students and by student-run stations. I also think, the adventurous programming, kind of free of commercial restrictions. We've seen the impact of playing this music on college radio, especially starting, say, 1970 and beyond, and record industry and labels, and then other radio stations taking a cue from what they're hearing on these radio stations and then changing their programming as a result. So you see that with alternative music and indie music, and how that then became kind of a genre on commercial radio. So after kind of giving you this backstory, I wanted to wrap up and talk a little bit about some of what I'm doing, or some of what a bunch of people are doing to help preserve college radio history. Because I'll go back to this one. I regularly tour college radio stations, and so some of what I'm doing is kind of scoping out what's out there and evangelizing to people. Hey, there's some cool stuff here. You might want to preserve it. And I'm part of the Radio Preservation Task Force, which is a project of the Library of Congress. And while it's largely focused on preserving audio, we also have information about preserving all kinds of materials. So I'm part of a college radio caucus on that task force, and we have a page on the Radio Preservation Task Force site where we give college radio stations a bunch of tips about digitizing material, give them ideas for resources, have examples of people who've done history projects. So just trying to share the word about that. And then very recently, I started working on the Digital Library of Amateur Radio and Communications, which is a project that's part of the Internet Archive. And it seemed that they were adding things beyond amateur radio. So I talked to them about, can we build a college radio collection within there? So I've been working with them since February to build a college radio archive, and largely starting with paper materials. So publications from college radio organizations, newsletters, and then I've been having a lot of fun finding zines, even zines from 2024. So we have over 350 items in there. That's at archive.org/details/college radio. So you can take a look at that. But I'm excited because people have handed me things over the years and I haven't known where to put them. So it's nice to have this digital archive to point people to. So it's things like zines, program guides, flyers, newsletters. And I'm also really excited about college radio history efforts that other people are doing. A number of students have written their college theses about the history of their radio station in recent years. And if that could happen at every college, then, that would be a dream. And Kate Jewell just wrote a new book, Live from the Underground, and she's really focusing on kind of the 70s to the 1990s in college radio and the music industry. So it's nice to have a new book about college radio history. And a documentary, 35,000 Watts, just came out that's also about kind of that similar era of college radio. And I was interviewed for that and talked probably for a big portion of my interview with them about early history of college radio. And I was worried that would all get on the cutting room floor. I'm like, the 1920s are not, that's not sexy, right? But I'm pleased that in the finished documentary there is some early radio stuff in there. So that's that's starting to get shown, especially on college campuses. And then I just wanted to thank California Historical Radio Society for all of your work in radio history of all kinds, and I know college radio is part of that. And I've been in communication with so many of you here for so many years, and I appreciate all of your help with my research, and I'm sure that will continue to happen, dipping into the archives and having personal conversations. And thanks so much for having me speak today.
All right, we will start a little Q&A now if anyone has questions.
Well,
right in front. Oh, sorry.
Hello, am I live? Yes. My experience in college radio was a bit later. In the 60s, I was hanging out with the WHRB at Harvard, which was, at that point, carrier current.
Yeah, nice.
And 880 watts ERP FM, which you could get for quite some distance, 10 miles or so away from the antenna. And there's a tale. They didn't like me, so I was only there for the trial period. Later on, there's a story from the 80s, when Ted Turner got in the broadcasting business. He discovered that somebody else owned the call letter WTBS, which was MIT. Yeah. And he said, I got a deal for you. If I can have that call, I'll buy you any transmitter and antenna you want. And they said, sold! And they became WMBR because their Walker Memorial basement radio was where they were housed. And that WHRB was interesting. It was a very cliquey bunch of people, but they ran a good station. And the unique programming was what they called orgies. At exam time, they broadcast, for example, for 72 hours, all of Bach, all of it in a row.
That's amazing. I definitely want to talk to you about
likewise
WHRB.
For the composers.
Yeah, they still do have the orgies over WHRB.
I expect. I'm out of range of them now, but I expect.
They have, I've heard that the archives there are incredible, and I visited WHRB, and I could see even in the radio station they had these books, and I remember this in college too. So they had notebooks where you could write notes.
Oh, the comment book. Oh, yes.
The comment books.
And the first, you got a new book. It was a big book about this thick. When the first new one came in, there was a great rush. Who got to page 525 first and put a script K in front of it, because that's a crucial number for Eine kleine Nachtmusik, a Mozart composition.
Wow.
These people were like that.
That's awesome.
Anyway.
Hi. I know you can only do so much, but I'm curious if there are other people looking into the South, the Southwest, Midwest, the rest of the country, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anybody else who's really that fascinated with the early period of college radio, and I try to, whenever I'm out of town, I'll visit a radio station, so some of it is just happenstance where I happen to be, so I would love to do more, and I haven't been, well, I've been to stations in Atlanta, so I, as far as this research, I'm kind of starting where I'm starting, but yeah, I mean, I wish this could happen everywhere, and I wish I had more stories to tell about California. Like, I started to do a little bit of kind of quick research, and there was amateur radio happening at Stanford University in the 20s, so I'm sure there are a lot of rich stories in the San Francisco Bay Area too, and the South. So yeah, I need like a benefactor.
Jennifer, you touched on the relationship between administration and these various college radio activities. Can you elaborate a little more on that? Were they just kind of agnostic to it, or did they try to encourage? Did they impede? Did they feel threatened? Explain a little more about that.
Yeah, I think it really varied. At Haverford, there's a tradition of student-run organizations being very independent from the administration, which continues until present day, and it's like a kind of a hallmark of the school that students really appreciate, that this is kind of where the action is. So, you know, you hear about in modern times things like the administration who holds the FCC license, for example. In the contemporary era, you know, it might be the Board of Trustees. You hear about stories about colleges deciding they want to sell off a radio license, for example, and the school is, you know, kind of the villain for that. And at Haverford, it was the students who decided they were going to sell their license to an outfit in Philadelphia. And I don't get the impression that the administration was involved in any way, shape, or form. Like, the license was held by the radio club, and it all seemed very independent. And, you know, that varies by college, and I haven't looked at every single example. So that's just one example where it seemed like the administration didn't really have much to do with it. And we saw in the example at Columbia where they're worried about their buildings, you know, like the wires marring the beautiful facade. So I think probably is the spectrum.
I was getting a laugh out of when you were talking about listening to the Quake, and when it went away, suddenly discovering college radio. Meanwhile, on college radio, they've been playing a lot of those bands right along.
Yeah.
And here in the Bay Area, we claim sometimes to have had the first commercial freeform station in KMPX. There's debates about who started doing that first. Have you done any research on when college radio shifted from trying to prepare people for commercial radio and shifting to freeform, bring records from home, play whatever you want, bottom-up programming, as opposed to here's the list, play it, and don't talk too much?
Yeah, I know. I wasn't cool enough to be like hip to college radio. Like, some of my friends were listening to KFJC and stuff earlier, and my dad was listening to KFJC probably before I was. So it took me a while since I was in the KSJO, KOME zone, and then like it took the Quake to then get me tuned in. As far as freeform, I think there's an interesting case to be made that a number of college radio stations were really doing freeform first. So, like, I've found articles, or I've found evidence of at Haverford College in the 50s, there were students who were, you know, airing beat poetry, and there was a show called The Furloin Teacup, I think. And I'd love to do more research about this, because there are people writing books about freeform, and I feel like college radio doesn't get enough credit for doing adventurous stuff from the very beginning. And obviously there's some college radio stations that operate under the auspices of communications departments and are more like training grounds. So college radio is super diverse. So I'm more fixated on student-run stations where you might have more of this kind of adventurous freeform programming. But that's not to say there aren't college radio stations that are tightly formatted and operate, you know, very similar to a professional station. Yeah.
Just a little story about my college radio days. I was in college radio at San Francisco City College from 1970 to 1973 and a half. And it was probably the best, one of the best times in my life. City College of San Francisco is a 2-year school, and I spent 3.5 years there because I was so enthralled with radio. I was a program director and manager and on the air and did theme shows and news director. I held every position that a commercial station person could hold there. And the last semester, the department chair came to me and said, I need somebody to become station manager again for next year. You're ready to leave. Would you stay? And I said, sure, I'll stay. And he said, but you've used all your broadcasting credits already. Can I give you leadership credits? I said, I don't care. But it was a great time between the people and what we were doing and what folks were allowed or permitted to, put on the air. And we were carrier current all the time within City College, but from 8 in the morning until noon, we were live on KALW.
Oh.
So not only did we have the carrier current, but we were also live on the air for 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. And that was really experience, in those days. When your chief engineer was an ex-Marine and you'd play something like Casey Jones on the radio, you'd get a phone call right away. So,
that's amazing.
But college radio was great, and it was. And thank you for doing this. It's an important part of our radio history and culture that should be preserved. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just down in Southern California for a screening of 35,000 watts that KSPC at Pomona College was putting on, and there were students about to graduate talking about their majors, and a few of them said, and I minored in KSPC. And I've heard so many stories about people nearly dropping out of college. Apparently William Halstead at Haverford, there's stuff about how, he was struggling, because he spent so much time on the radio activities.
That was me. My first semester in college, I took all the required courses. I flunked English 1A because I never went to it, and I was going to drop out of college. But my brother-in-law, who's passed away years and years ago, the only good thing he said was, don't drop out, don't take required courses, look through the catalog, talk to people, and just take what you want next semester. And one of the first things I took was a broadcasting history course, and I was hooked.
That's great. I love it.
Jennifer, are there any connections between pirate radio and college radio?
Totally. I mean, in some carrier current stations call themselves pirate radio, even though, and some stations have operated beyond what they were really supposed to be doing on carrier current, so they verged into that territory. So every time I visit a radio station, I write up a field trip report, and there was a station at Pratt Institute, and all of their branding has pirate flags, and there's all this lore about that, and so I was trying to figure out the backstory, and it took a lot of Googling and looking on the Wayback Machine on old station websites, and then I finally tracked down, because apparently there were these rumors that this station manager had been rogue and took the station pirate, and then they were heard apparently all over Brooklyn, and and I have friends who work in pirate radio research. They're like, I don't know about this at all. Tell me more. But it turns out that I ended up talking to the guy, and they were trying to do, sort of this legal kind of, and all of you know way more about the technology than I do, but they were trying to do a legal form of FM that was campus only, that still allowed them to operate under these Part 15 rule, where they were not broadcasting too far. So I think they were trying to do this FM, and he was doing all the stuff he thought was legit, corresponding with technical experts, but apparently the FM broadcast went too far, and maybe there was a call by the FCC, but it was all very, it was not as dramatic as decades later it made it seem like, this kid was thrown out of school, and none of that happened. It was just sort of a misunderstanding, so they weren't trying to be pirate. But I'm sure that there were stations that have been set up at college campuses that were intentionally pirate, let's go as far as we can.
What's your feeling about the current health of college radio, especially on FM, with broadcast licenses being so valuable?
Yeah. So I feel like students are still super interested in college radio, and I feel very energized every time I visit a radio station. And I stopped visiting during COVID and started going back out in fall 2022, and There's just so much amazing energy, and after doing all of, after digging into this whole 100-year history, to me, the method of broadcasting has become less important. Because like at San Francisco State, I think they're broadcasting over a public address system, which I hadn't realized, and so for so in a way it kind of doesn't matter, even though I think FM is hugely important. I think terrestrial radio is hugely important, and I don't want schools to give up those licenses because they won't get them back. But I think things are healthy, and there are still college radio organizations who are going for low power FM licenses in this most recent window. So I think there's still interest in terrestrial. So I feel optimistic.
Well, an inside comment.
I know.
Well, that was sort of my question. So, but actually, I was thinking back when you were talking about carrier current in the 40s. Was there any, in your sort of research, did you uncover any sort of connection with skills learned during wartime? Was there any sort of overlap with what was happening with World War II that either sort of helped to elevate skill sets, or maybe sort of it was a distraction? People had to go off to war, and if you're exempt, if you're in college or whatever. Was there any sort of overlap in what was happening in war, either pre, during, or post World War II?
Oh, World War II.
Right, because this carrier current was coming around, you said like 1941 or early 40s.
Yeah, and that I haven't dug into as much as, I've been a lot more fixated on the 20s, and so World War I was super important for that, but I haven't dug as much into World War II. So TBD.
Are there any other questions? Jennifer, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you.